Good morning, thank you all for being here. In an early chapter of her 1913 publication, The Future of the Women's Movement, Helen wrote the following. It has been customary to divide female humans into women and mothers. This is altogether false. Women should not be trained to be mothers. To do so at once introduces all sorts of arbitrary limitations and restrictions and hampers the very mission it is designed to serve. Women should be trained to be whole human beings. The measure of a woman's motherhood, like the measure of her love, is the measure of her whole nature. Cramp her nature, limit her activities, and you cramp and limit her love and her motherhood. In calling for women to be defined by something other than potential, eventual, or actual motherhood, indeed not to be defined as a homogeneous group, Swanwick was neither pioneering nor unique. However, this was the central tenet in a book which sought to explore issues which affected women and issues which might be changed as a result of women's having the vote. In the opening pages, she reminded readers that the women's movement in Great Britain has, for the last 7 years, been directed so considerably into political channels. The struggle for the parliamentary vote has absorbed so much of the active, organised and thinking women of the nation that one hears people talk sometimes as if the suffrage movement were the women's movement, and as if, when the vote shall be won, there will be no more women's movement. One would have to be very shallow and insular, too, to think so. And what a tragedy it would be. What? Shall all these sacrifices be made to get the vote, and then nothing be done with it? Shall the vote be at once the record of the progress of women and its grave? Thus, she attempted to remind readers of the scope and scale of the possibilities in front of them, and that the vote was a starting point and not an end in itself. As has been noted by Carol Dyehouse, amongst others, Swanwick's emphasis on women's right to choose the shape and focus of their lives and their right to work outside the home while married and child rearing was informed by her own personal experience. First, when her mother opposed her attending Girton, she eventually managed to, and then during the early days of her marriage when she found herself longing for paid work and kind of opportunities outside the home. When she published The Future of the Women's Movement, Swanwick was a well-known figure in suffrage circles. Although she has been rather more remembered by most historians as a feminist pacifist campaigner, because this of course dominated her later life, Swanwick had served as an NUWSF speaker and as editor of the Common Cause until her decision to resign in 1912, owing to irreconcilable differences over editorial policy. She had therefore been at the forefront of the suffrage campaigns, but was now able to speak more freely outside the constraints of organisational and editorial policy. Now, I'm approaching Swanwick's text, as Lucy mentioned at the beginning, as part of a much wider project on married women's right to work in this period, and the wider project as a whole examines formal marriage bars established by employers, social and cultural expectations of women's roles, and questions of why married women might need or want to work. Swanwick's book was published just before the height of marriage bars, that is, sort of formal restrictions on married women's right to work imposed by employers, and the height of these was the interwar years. However, in 1914 there were formal marriage bars in the civil service and at some levels of teaching, and it was of course widespread social custom that middle-class women and those from often more stable working-class circumstances would resign from work on marriage. Marriage and paid work, and particularly marriage, motherhood and paid work, were widely believed to be incompatible. In her discussions of how women should be categorised, Swanwick attempted to challenge this idea and also to think about the practical differences that women faced. Swanwick was critical of the feminists she saw as overly keen to dismiss disruptions that potential or actual marriage and motherhood could cause to women's position in the workplace. And she argued that they played down such disruptions in order to be able to make the case that men and women were actually equal. She was also class-conscious in a way that some early 20th century discussions about married women's right to work were not, demonstrating that some married women needed to work and arguing that reactionaries who put up obstacles to married women's work also at the same time were doing nothing to alleviate the circumstances that might compel them to have to work outside the home whilst also doing domestic duties and potentially childcare. Her writing was particularly image-rich. Analogies, she wrote, are often misleading, but in modern England the picture is fairly correct, which shows a woman with a baby at her breast, one hand tied behind her by trade and legal restrictions, her eyes closed with the bandage of ignorance, her mouth gagged by the refusal of voting rights, hampered by the skirt of custom, having to struggle over the same rock-encumbered ground as man, unburdened with head erect and limbs free. So protective legislation, a lack of voting rights, social custom and women's own ignorance were then all contributory factors to women's position. And obviously she doesn't mean women's ignorance is their fault, but the conditions in which women have been educated, etc. She's also quite interesting in terms of how she talks about women's work and the sort of market value of women's work. And she points out that using kind of a language and an analogy that feels perhaps more awkward to us now, she argues that the economic slavery of women is worse and more difficult to deal with than any other slavery, and it cannot be met by machinery only. It must be met by a change of heart, a change as needful in women themselves as in men. Women must have pride and belief in themselves and their work, and men must leave off applying to women a cash standard wholly inappropriate to that part of the community whose work is so largely for the future. This is one of those interesting passages in the book where I think she's trying to get at this sort of sense of motherhood as a valuable and social economic type of work for women, but then talking about the way that this then affects the value that employers attach to women in the workplace. Swanwick's style overall and approach was actually at times somewhat risky. One can imagine bits of her work being selectively quoted to actually argue an anti-feminist point. For example, she argued that many of the reasons advanced for women's lower pay and more precarious position in the workplace had, quote, a basis in fact. This does not, she immediately quipped, increase my enthusiasm for facts as they are. On the contrary, it makes me cast about for some means of changing them, and some of them seem to be already in course of rapid change. She added that not enough had been done to minimise the factors that affected women's abilities and rights to play a full part in the workforce. Nevertheless, she argued these reasons for women's disadvantage in the workplace were often based on misperceptions or misreadings of the situation, and she offered examples of how improvements might be made. On the marriage bar or social expectations of the conventional housewife specifically, she argued that the liability of women to marry and pass out of wage earning is a drawback which will always exist to some extent, but which would be greatly reduced by better organisation. Presumably this was a reference to unionising against marriage bars, but she doesn't actually elaborate on this. She argued that the number of women pin money workers, as they were referred to, was actually far smaller than was generally believed, but she clearly also disapproved of them, arguing that women could unionise to, quote, practically eliminate this peculiarly obnoxious type of blackleg. And I think it's interesting how unquestioningly she seems to have absorbed this particular piece of rhetoric, this idea that some women worked simply to pay for frivolities, when elsewhere her writing offered quite detailed critique, and she herself had personal motivations for working that were not necessarily related to economics. She also made an interesting argument against the marriage bar, which was not really seen elsewhere. Marriage bars, she said, meant that there were women flooding the job market in other occupations where no such bars existed. Again, she offered no evidence to support this, and it is worth noting that gendered occupational segregation in this period was particularly influential, of course, in determining the rights and determining the kinds of work available to women. Therefore, if Swanwick was right, the marriage bar and occupational segregation compounded one another. As commentators addressing this topic during this period and indeed in the future also had to do, Swanwick considered the what about the children and related questions. She argued that in many cases it made economic sense for women to perform the housewifely duties in their own home if they were also caring for children, and that as most children did not need their guardians' full attention at all times, this provided some space for the performance of household chores, amongst other things. However, she was insistent on the wife's right to a share in the household income, arguing not unreasonably that were the situation reversed, men would not be content simply with feeling loved and being provided for by their partner. More than this, Swanwick argued, if women were not adequately compensated for their domestic labour, it is likely that in modern times she will be tempted to go out to work, quote, and when it would actually be better for all concerned, she argued for women to stay at home and work. By couching the point in this way, Swanwick seemed to slightly reframe the desire to work solely into a point about financial need, rather than managing to sort of continue to hold up the argument that women might indeed have other motivations for wanting to take paid work. The idea of the woman who quote, should stay at home and work also came perilously close to asserting traditional gender roles, even though it was probably actually meant to be a point about the practicalities that Swanwick was trying to emphasise around domestic work, childcare, and the need to actually have the house taken care of. At the same time, Swanwick made very specific points about financial necessity, adding very often the woman is not merely tempted but forced to go to work outside the home. The result is that we see women with the treble burden of childbearing, wage earning out of the home, and housework within the home. Small wonder when each of these is ill done. The marvel is how well done any of them are. Missing here, though, I think, was a discussion about an understanding of how men's low pay might actually be the root cause of women feeling compelled to work outside the home. Swanwick's conclusion of sorts was forward-thinking for 1913. Indeed, we find commentators arguing similar points with the same sense of novelty and innovation half a century later. Returning to her earlier theme of the differences between women, she argued that it was logical that not all women were talented housekeepers and cooks, and those who were not should not be corralled into being such. Why not frankly admit that women differ, she wrote, and always will differ? Why try to press them all into the same mould? If a woman has been a highly trained and very competent class teacher before her marriage, is it wisdom or economy to declare that after her marriage she must abandon all her special training, her natural and acquired gifts, and black her husband's boots and cook his dinner? Even if she has babies, is there any reason why she should become a general servant? And there was perhaps a tinge of classism or elitism in this example, the implication, kind of intended or not, being that the higher levels of training and experience of the teacher gave her a better reason to resist domestic chores. Still, Swanwick went further to argue that as men did not choose their wives with the sole or chief criterion of motherly or housewifely ability, society should more readily accept that the perfect wife, mother, nurse, teacher, and housekeeper is very rarely one person. She goes on to argue that the future was cooperative housekeeping and childcare, and that it was a collective discussion and decision-making sort of process, and this was what this was the conversation that society needed to have. And pointedly, she argues, quote, men must give the woman of the future her head in order to come up with a suitable solution. So to sort of wrap up a little bit, Swanwick was joining a chorus of increasing numbers of women in this period who tried to square the circle of women not wanting to have to choose between work and marriage and possible motherhood, and whilst at the same time trying to find solutions to the fact that children needed to be cared for, paid domestic help was not within the purview of all, and professional childcare services were rare and usually open to only the most privileged. This strand of thought continued in middle-class feminist debate, particularly in middle-class feminist debate throughout the interwar years, and indeed Swanwick herself would make several interventions in this debate in the feminist periodical Time and Tide in the late 1920s. With the desirability of the vote as an anchor and a focus, the future of the women's movement attempted to function as a means to remind readers of the wider struggle and of the possibilities, both tangible and intangible, that women's political power might bring with it. However, as we've seen, Swanwick's train of thought was not unproblematic. Although she was class conscious, there were still points at which she did not appreciate the full economic or situational implications of her suggestions and critiques. And not every idea is necessarily well enough thought through in this text. But at the same time, Swanwick's text, I think, is interesting and an important achievement. Given the broad and vague title, The Future of the Women's Movement, the book was a specific discussion of what else, in particular, in conjunction with the vote, might make the biggest difference to women's lives.